All right. So anyway, like we said in the email last week, we're just gonna do some mixing, and this is gonna be very introductory level. We're kind of just gonna take a couple steps back because we know this is definitely something that is definitely like these are some very like niche things that don't seem niche, like they seem really important, but are definitely like skipped over a couple times, especially if you don't like build a workflow around a couple of these things. So I'm gonna start out with when you're given just a couple stems, like for example, we have these wonderful stems recorded by Michael from the MFE live stream that he did a couple months ago. And so this session is really nice because it's only a total of 11 tracks versus like getting a professional quote unquote score of like 100 plus tracks. It's not too much to like take in all at once. It's just nice and easy, but it gives you it's pretty much a full mix of a band. So anyway, so when you first get all of these stems, I want to hear from you guys. Like, what do you think we should do? What's the first thing we should do?
Don't all jump at once.
I was gonna say I'm gonna pick somebody.
Can I? Oh wait, no. Like let me.
Listen first to see where we're at because we haven't actually heard yet.
Oh yeah, do you want me to do? What? Go ahead, Jake.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I just said, what would you do first when opening a session?
I would start labeling everything.
And conveniently for us, they're all fairly labeled.
The next step I would do is color code by group.
Yes, color coding. That's what I wanted. So I'm not going to ask, does everybody know what color coding is? It's color coding. But also, I apologize if my color coding is not your color coding. But I'm going to do this the way I'm used to it.
And this is something that is completely optional, but at the end of the day, it really does help a lot to have it visually mapped out.
Yeah, it's easier to see a lot of tracks with different colors than to see all tracks that are the same color. And at least for me, I'll walk through my color coding process. So usually for me, I like to do drums in red. I like to do bass in orange. I do like orchestra stuff and like this weird like purpley thing. Same with BGs. They're in the same as main vocals.
What's a BG?
Background vocal. Yes, Gavin, I couldn't hear you.
It's just Memphis. So
hi, Memphis.
You're saying to like pick a color for each different group that you feel best represents it and try to organize it that way and stick to it.
Yep. Yeah, like don't like change it via the project. Like make something consistent by the instrument so it doesn't change for projects. So then you can open every single project. It looks the same. Like nothing like screws with you. You'll look at it and be like, oh, there's my drums, there's my bass, there's my guitar, so on and so forth. It's just the same, like building that repetitive pattern kind of thing. It's also like just establishing the workflow or like building your personal workflow. Because not everybody's workflow is the same, but once you get a workflow that works for you, then it just makes your work so much easier. That's the whole point of it.
And I know in like other DAWs, like Ableton specifically, because that's what I use, you can just group things together as well. So if you really don't have the time to color code everything, you can just group it all together really quickly. So like there's always a way to organize your like tracks and whatnot, and you should definitely take the time and do that because it makes it a lot quicker overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and honestly, and what I'm doing right now, I should probably explain. So what I'm also ordering, this kind of goes with the color coding. So like, did you see how before the tracks were all just kind of spread out? Like there was a guitar in between some of the drum tracks. There was the bass like up at the top. Like it was all over the place. What I'm doing now is I'm just condensing. So like, see how all my drums are now together, and then all my like my vocals are together. Like everything's now together. So now the colors are set, and it's not like this just kind of mismatched thing. This is also just kind of on that same thing of building your workflow. Like I'll even get more picky between the instruments. Like for example, I like to see my kick first. I have a particular order for all my drums. Like I like to see kick and then snare and then toms and then overhead / cymbals, whatever rooms going on and so forth. Bass is pretty straightforward. You usually just get a DI anyway. Guitar, same thing.
What's a DI versus like miking a bass?
Ooh, good question. So I'm just going to solo this. So a DI is when you take the signal that's coming straight out of the instrument, usually a stringed instrument like a guitar or bass or like an electric violin or something like that. It's just the electric signal coming directly from the pickups on the instrument, not being affected by any amplification or coloration from an amp. Versus when you mic up a speaker, you're getting coloration from not only the amp and the speakers that are in the cabinet, you're also getting coloration from the microphone. So you're getting a vastly different signal than what you started out with. So anyway, on that. So after coloring and ordering and all that stuff, sometimes I'll set up buses, which what do you guys like to use buses for? Like, how do you group your buses? I'm curious. Or have you tried using buses? Say it again, Gavin. I'm sorry.
Reverb.
That's one. That's one. I like to get even more simpler than that. So I'm going to walk through this. So I'm going to add a track. I'm going to call it, right now I don't have too much, but I'm going to call it overhead sum. Usually the way I like to use it is if I have like a stereo grouping of tracks. So like, for example, the overheads, they're two parts of a whole image. It's just the left part of the drum set and the right part of the drum set, but together they make a whole image. So what I like to do is, since it's a stereo image, I like to put them into a bus so I can affect them together instead of having to put double the amount of effects on the left and the right channel. Instead, I'm just putting it all into one. So so in Reaper, it's a little bit different, which that's what I'm using, by the way. I forgot to mention. I wanted to use something different than Pro Tools or Logic or something. One, because it's different and we're trying to apply concepts that but that you can see that they're usable in other DAWs and formats. And also, this is just because of what I'm used to. And I don't have Pro Tools on this computer. But anyway, what will we do after all of this? What's next? What's next?
Listen to it.
Go farther than that.
And volume mix it while you do it.
There you go. That's what I was looking for. So what Memphis means by a volume mix, when he says that, is what we're doing is we're essentially leveling everything out. So you're going through, because when you get everything at 0 dB, there's no way things are just going to be automatically balanced from the start. Like there's something, especially if it's a direct, especially if it's a DI or something might be slightly too loud than if it was recorded in the room, and they don't blend as well together right now than if we would volume mix it. And what also comes with volume mixing is panning. So in volume mixing, you are mixing the volumes, but you're also panning everything around. So like I was saying with your stereo sources, you're going to pan those. I usually do that either when I'm listening or while I'm doing it. Usually I'll just play the song through, and then usually within a full run through of the song, I can usually get a decent volume and panning mix. Excuse me. So anyway, I'm just going to play the song, and I will do a quick little volume and panning mix. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to stop me.
Rainy or sunny, cloudy or snowing, know that you've always hated this cold, and it's getting old in the ways that I thought it. Snowing on the day that I was on it. And if I don't miss you, then why do I bother checking the weather wherever you are? And it's getting old that I even care. Who cares that it's 74? Can't change the weather, so you're stuck with snow. I'm hoping you can make it, just make it on home. And rain in your city doesn't mean that you'll miss me. So eyes to my mind. If I don't that it's 74.
Cool. I think that's a pretty good starting point. So the other thing I am going to do is I'm going to find where the audio cuts off.
One take.
One take.
A sabais.
Nice. There's a little voice bite from Michael. That was great.
That's why you always let it roll at least like a few seconds after the song's over, because you're going to get some little nuggets of gold from
at least
the banter.
So the one thing I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to add a fade to all the tracks, just so there's a nice fade out, and then I'm going to add one on the fade in, just so there's no popping or clicking, and everything just sounds nice and pretty. Sure, that doesn't... And what I'm trying to catch is I'm trying to catch just the silence. I'm not trying to influence the performance in any way. I'm just trying to catch any silence, because if I catch it, especially at the beginning and the end, that'll get rid of all your clicks and pops. So, on that point, any comments from there? Anything you guys liked about this? What are just your thoughts after a first listen?
I just want to clarify also that like this was not multi-tracked in the studio or anything. This is actually a recording of a live performance. So all of the band members were playing this song live together. So we didn't like track the drums separate or the bass separately. This is actually all tracked simultaneously. So just to give a little bit of context.
Thank you. I forgot to mention that. That is really important.
Grant, did you have any trouble like when it came to mixing the vocal tracks, since obviously like the drums would have bled into that just a little bit?
You will. I'm going to say this in future tense because I haven't. This is the first time I've opened this.
Okay, well, just like going forward, like with how you would like go about mixing it.
Yeah. So, and again, we'll touch on Vox and guitar a lot more in depth next week. But I'll just, for example, I'll just solo it like in the vocal itself. You pretty much get a whole drum mix going on in there. Even when you get to the vocals,
Rainy or sunny, cloudy.
the drums are just constantly there.
In the
You're
background.
never going to be rid of them, and that's just kind of the way it is. Like, you're just kind of stuck with that. There's nothing you can do. There's no post editing that'll save that. Like, there's some little tricks you can do, which again we'll touch on next 2 weeks from now. But yeah, you just have to keep that in mind that now you pretty much have a full mix going through your vocal mics now.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing I will say is if you are trying to get rid of sound in between words on the vocal, you can use a tactic called gating. I don't think we're going to get into gating during this meeting, but you might want to take a note and check that out after we're done, because that is one workaround for that problem.
And again, we'll go super in depth on some more vocal and guitar stuff and violin too next week. But yeah, for now in this meeting, we'll just talk about drums and bass. So anyway, now focusing on to drums and bass specifically, is there anything that comes to mind immediately? Is there anything that you like, that you don't like? Like, just any first thoughts? Gotta use your noggins.
Bass player sounds good.
All right, hold on. No, I'm kidding.
Not that you're biased.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Michael, are you sure you aren't a little biased there?
Maybe you could like solo the bass and drums, and we could listen to a little bit of it without like everything
So
else.
that might be a good idea, just to get that clear vision of it.
I
Great suggestion.
agree.
Memphis has an initial idea.
Yeah, I was
Memphis, what is your initial idea?
gonna say the violin was very loud in the first half.
Yeah, that's also what I was going to say, but
part of me thought it was just because I'm a violinist, so that sticks out to me. But it was loud.
Yeah, there's a couple things. Again, we'll touch violin next week, but there's a couple things I'll address with drums too.
I think that the vocals are also a bit loud in like in the grand scheme of things.
They were loud. Interesting. I mean, we're also at the same time, we also have to keep in mind that we're also listening through laptop speakers too. Most of you guys probably are. Which is okay, but like that's a good medium to listen through sometimes. Like whenever I make a mix, the first place I'll listen to it is I'll put it on my phone and I'll listen to it on my phone because that's where most people are going to be listening to things. So it's like you always have to keep that stuff in mind. Like you just like, oh, I'm not going to listen. I have $600 speakers. Why would I listen to my crappy phone? But it's just like you're the only person that really owns these $600 speakers. Like the average person doesn't have that. They don't have these huge setups or anything. They just have their phone. That's all they're going to play it on. So that's what really matters. Same with your car. Like I always do my car as the second one. Your car will tell you if your mix sounds bad immediately. All right.
Yeah, definitely, Ani. You always listen on the crappiest speakers you can find, and in your car, and on AirPods, because that's where 90% of people listen to music.
Listen everywhere. If we're just talking about referencing and like just trying to like nail in your mix on different mediums, like even something as simple as like taking like a boombox, like a Bluetooth speaker, like taking it out of your room, like taking it into another space, because the space itself has its own reflections and it also influences you. So if you're in a controlled room playing a Bluetooth speaker, that's not going to matter because most 90% of the time Bluetooth speakers are used in like outdoorsy open areas. So it's like you have to try it in different environments too. But anyway,
Yeah, Dropbox it to yourself and like put it on your phone and just go around.
Or Google Drive. Google Drive works
Or
really
Google
well because
Drive.
you don't have to download it.
Yeah, that's kind of an
Either
aside.
way.
That's kind of something you touch on during mastering at the end of the mixing process, but definitely important to note
Yeah,
for
but
sure.
we're really not going to get to mastering in this time, so
No.
do that.
We can if you want. But
I
alright,
mean,
so I'm just
you
gonna
can, but it's not going to be a great mix.
yeah, I'm gonna loop a section here just because the drums aren't always playing as loud. So I'm gonna pick one of the loudest moments that the drums play along with the bass, and then I'm just gonna loop that section. Oh, you can even hear the vocals in a drum track. I won't let that play again too much, but any thoughts?
How's that kick sound to everybody? What do people feel about the kick?
I feel like it could be punchier.
This is just the kick.
Yeah, maybe add a little more of the low end, because to me it sounds a little...
Yeah, I have a couple. So
The simple splash here, says Ani. Yeah, definitely.
let's just look at the kick real quick first. So I'm going to try, just a disclaimer, I'm going to try and use as many free and stock things as possible.
What are we looking at right?
So we're just looking at an FX menu. This is just a plugin directory. But I'm going to pick as many free / cheap things that I have, or stock things, to show that you don't need a $200 FabFilter plugin to do things, even though I do have those. But so let me find. It gets really annoying when you have a lot of plugins.
So every time Grant opens up a plugin, that might be a good moment to just write it down quick so you don't forget what it is.
So I'm also picking ones that are visual. So sometimes I'm going to go over visual more than free, because sometimes the free ones don't have the best displays. So this one in particular comes if you buy a Focusrite interface, which is not technically free, but it's the most visual one that I have, and I like using this one for teaching things. So this is really cool auto release too. That's interesting. But so I'm just going to play through it and do what I would do in terms of compression, and then we'll just touch on it from your perspective. right, cool. Oh, I got to read the chat so fast.
So what are you doing with this plugin? What is it? What does it do? What are you doing?
Yes. So my next point. So what I'm pretty much doing, I'll talk about what I'm looking for in the audio track. So if I disable it, so see how there's a huge difference? See how there's those little ghost hits right before the kick? Like that da-da. Like that second hit is a lot louder than the first one. So what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to bring them a little bit closer together so it sounds like they're at similar volumes. So what I look for mainly, so I'm just going to keep this playing while I talk. So what I'm looking for is I'm dropping the threshold, which is telling the compressor when to kick in. I'm dropping it until it's hitting those loudest peaks, and then I just go a little bit past that. So I want to just be right above those littlest hits, but I don't want to clamp down on them because they're already really quiet. And if I clamp down too hard, I'm just going to be bringing up that vocal that you hear in the background, which it's getting into the kick, which is pretty impressive. Either on the vocalist perspective or the mic perspective, but actually, curious question, Michael, where was this, where did you mic the kick?
The kick was mic'd, I believe, outside.
Like
I
right,
don't think
like right
I
in
don't
the
think
port?
the kick drum had a port. So I think it was outside the kick
So
drum head.
it was just a flat head. Did you put it like in the middle, I guess? Trying to guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. And the reason I mainly asked this is just because I'm trying to that explains the bleed is because it's not in the drum. So it's competing with everything else because it's not isolated as much as it would usually be in a studio setting. And sometimes this is just what you run into. Like sometimes the drummer's kick just doesn't have a port on it and you just kind of have to deal with that. But in considering that, you also have to think, wait, there's not going to be as much attack. There's not going to be as much low end because you're not in the kick drum. You're not in that chamber of oscillating low end. There's just going to be a couple things that you're missing. You have to keep that in mind. So that's kind of why it sounds a little pillowy, is the way I would describe it.
Right, because we're not picking up the beater on the other side of the drum head.
Yep.
So we don't have any click, really like no high end in that kick at all.
Yeah, and the reason I bring that up in terms of sound is because the recording stage matters a lot more than the mixing stage. Like, there's only so much I can do to fix this, or fix, quote unquote, to the industry standard. There's only so much I can do to this. So it's really crucial that gets, quote unquote, right in the recording stage. So anyway, jumping back to the compressor. So again, threshold, catching the bigger beats, lingering right above the smaller beats. And then I'm using a quicker attack because I want it to get those louder beats. I don't want all that volume to squeeze through. I want it to catch it relatively quickly. And I'm having a fast release to make it a little bit punchier because I don't want it to catch any of that. I don't want it to compress any of the bleed or anything that's after the hit. I just want it to compress the hit itself. And then in terms of ratio, and like Annalise said in the chat, these are all very, very like flexible and loose kind of things. Like there's no do or die way to do some of this. There are some ways or preferred methods, but generally it's it's like based on whatever sound you're going for.
It's more important to use your ears doing all of this mixing than it is to look at the numbers or look at them.
So a perfect example, what I was doing, I used my ears a second ago. So what I was doing, did you notice earlier when I turned the plugin off and I was doing something back and forth? Did anybody notice that? Does anybody know what I was doing?
You said you were turning the plugin off.
Yeah. Do you know why I was doing that?
Yeah, you're trying to the original sound, not just changes.
Say that again, Memphis. The kick track was still playing.
Yeah, you were like doing that to make sure you're making like good improvements and not just changes. You want to make sure it sounds better than what the original track was.
Yes and no. But the main reason, yes, I was doing it for that. But the main reason I was doing it was to make sure my makeup gain was even. So like if I drop the makeup gain the whole way back down after doing all this compression and I turn the plugin on, hear how the whole track. Oh, okay. I don't know where that came from. Anyway.
Sounds quiet.
Yeah, see how the whole track's volume just dropped? So if I turn it back off again.
In fairness, it's a tiny laptop, but I can sort of hear it.
Yeah, the laptop really is not going to tell you. I know you guys don't have the opportunity, but if everybody else has headphones nearby, I would highly suggest using them. But anyway, so what I'm doing is I'm trying to even out my volume level before and after compression. So I'm trying to get it back to this level. So I'm trying to get everything kind of at that same level. So if I turn it back on again and bring it up a little bit, turn it off. There we go. Okay, now when I turn it on and off, they're pretty much the same volume with a little variance. There we go. Cool. All right. On to the next thing. So I'm going to do an EQ moves. So I'm going to use this plugin. This is called TDR Nova. This is a free dynamic EQ plugin. So if I turn on in, you get to see the whole frequency wave going on. This is really, I would highly suggest this over, because I know the Pro Tools one does not give you a display, and that's really annoying. This plugin also has a really nice feature where if I select a band, I can turn on dynamic mode. So whenever a specific frequency passes a certain threshold, it'll pull the band down, and then you can it works like a compressor, but just for a specific frequency. It's almost like a multi-band compressor, but it works slightly different because it's a dynamic EQ, but it's pretty much the same thing.
Can you just type the name of this plugin into the chat so we can...
Yes. It's a little difficult to find, like the download button, but it is definitely nice.
And also, do you want to just speak on the order of compressor then EQ, or EQ then compressor?
Ooh, this is a tough one. So I know I talked about this a lot with my studio or my recording one students last semester. I think Gavin can attest to this, but and Ross is here too. But I personally, this is kind of one of those things I'm a little bit more hard strung on, because I think it really affects your end result. Like, I always do compression then EQ, and the reason I do that is just because when you're compressing something, you're changing the equalization balance of it. Like, you're bringing everything that was previously at, like, so say you do a cut, I'm going to give an example. Say you do a cut at like 2K or something like that. When you compress, 2K and everything else comes up. So if you do a cut of like 3 dB, but then do compression and then do makeup gain of 3 dB on the compressor, that's afterwards, you're pretty much negating that EQ move that you're doing. So I always do EQ afterwards, but that's also because most of my EQ is reductive, or reductive, is that the right word? Yeah. Subtractive, yes. There we go.
Which means you're taking things out rather than adding more volume to certain frequencies. You're dipping things out.
Yep, because you can quote unquote add volume with like a multitude of different things. Like, I could add a different plugin or add a different sound source or something that would change the volume. But I'm just trying to get rid of anything that sounds more or less unpleasant. So now that we're at EQ, where would you guys start? What comes to mind? What do you hear?
You want to cut the highs.
How so, Jake?
With a low pass filter.
Okay, so I'll turn on a low pass filter. Where do you want me to go to?
6K.
So that's a 6K. We're also at a 24 dB per octave slope, which means that's pretty much just means how steep the slope is. So if I go to like 6 dB per octave, see how it's really gentle. Then I jump to like 72 dB per octave and it's just straight down. You're just affecting how harsh that slope is. The stock for this plugin is 24, but I usually jump between 24 and 12 depending on the aspect. So, does everybody think of that? Does everybody like that change?
I actually would maybe try and do the opposite and try to boost some of the highs, especially where there might be some clickiness, since it's so lacking in any high frequency content.
let's try this. Yes, Anio, I will list all that I use. Most of what I use. So let's do... So this plugin also has this really nice function where you can solo a band. So like now we're just hearing high end. It's really helpful to like, especially if there's like a piercing frequency somewhere, it's really nice to narrow it in. So let's go find. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sweep. So what I do is I boost it almost as far as I can go, and I just keep sweeping along the frequencies till I find something that I want. Like right about there, right about 3 something, there's a little bit there, but I want to see if I can get some of the clickier stuff is a little bit higher up. So I'm going to see, I know there's a lot of bleed in this track, so my chances are pretty low. I'm going to see if there's any more higher up. So there's a little bit up here at 5.5, but hear how it's mostly snares and cymbals. And if boosting anything like that is just going to be more harm than good. So I'm going to go back to that 3.3. This is probably the strongest. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring it back down a little bit. And as we can see, compared to the whole balance of the frequency spectrum, there's not a lot of high end that just exists in the first place, which is a problem because we can't create more high end. Like that just doesn't, you can't create sound. That's why I like to use the subtractive EQ, because you're also encouraging those good characteristics of just pulling bad things out instead of trying to add stuff in. If you're trying to add stuff in, that's the entire recording stage. That's what that's all for. That's all the adding. Now you do some adding, but this is pretty much the sculpting and the shaping. So, in my opinion, I'm going to try something. Oh, go ahead, Michael.
I think basically what Grant's saying is you want to make it sound as good as you can while you're recording it. So you don't have to make any drastic changes. In this instance, I was recording this with the intention of live streaming it, and I knew that people weren't going to be listening much for the audio quality. And that's why we did what we did with the kick. So like Grant said, you can't really fix it after it's recorded, but you can make small changes to tighten it up, at least.
Mm-hmm. Oh, one small thing I forgot to mention plugin-wise. Focusrite, if you own one of their interfaces, they do monthly free plugin. They either do a free plugin or they do discounts every single month. So like if you log into your account, you can see under where your licenses are. If you click, there's a little button that says where's my bundled software, and they give you a bunch of free stuff monthly. It's so nice. But I would highly recommend looking at that if you have it in your own interface. So anyway, back to the EQ. So I'm gonna suggest something. What I was harping on, I was trying to harp on it with what I was saying earlier, but I was talking about subtractive EQ and taking stuff away. So what I'm going to do, so to me, this track also has a lot of mids, and where the vocal sits in the range, there's a lot of mids, but if I want it punchier, I need more low end and more high end. So in my mind, I think cut the mids. So I'm going to find out where the mids are most omnipresent. Yeah, like all that boxiness.
You're boosting and sweeping right now.
I'm boosting and sweeping. I could do a solo, but I'm boosting. It's such a wide band, I don't really need to. It's like, hear how right there it's all boxy? It sounds like you're smacking a cardboard box with a stick. So I'm going to pull that out. I'm going to widen it out a little bit. And hear how I'm going to go back and forth, but hear how it's already getting a little bit punchier. Now we have to be a little bit extreme again because of recording, but that's the whole point of this. So I'm just gonna take it in and out. Always do before and after checks. Like sometimes you don't even notice what you're doing. Like it's always nice to like do those before and after checks because you catch your ear up to where you are. You bring your ears back into perspective, because that's something that definitely, that and ear fatigue. Does anybody know what ear fatigue is?
Your ears start to like hear things the same way after a little while.
What's another way of saying it? I mean, it's kind of in the word definition of fatigue.
You listen to something that's the same for so long that it tires your ears out.
Yes. Your ears literally get tired after listening to something for so long. Like, I always have to take, like, if I mix, usually the good time is like 2 hours. Like if you're over 2 hours, your ears are going to start to get fatigued no matter what you do. Even if you're listening at quiet volumes, you've just been so hyper focused, you're literally flexing your ears. So by that much time, your ears start to get tired. Like if you do it long enough, you'll get to the point where it gets like headaches. You start to feel some like hypertension in the back of your neck. Like it's really bad. But my point being is like always try and like shock yourself out of that linear listening path by doing like those little things, like turning off an EQ move you just made to bring your ears back into perspective and kind of like keep them in check. It's a good way to at least elongate it a little bit.
Yeah. Plus, comparing EQ to non-EQ tells you if you actually like it or if you're just telling yourself you like it.
Yes, exactly. If you turn it on and off, you might have just done it just because you think you like it. But that and listening to it, if I unsolo this and do that mid cut, I just do it with the bass. Hear how the kick kind of disappears a little bit? It's really subtle.
I think they're right here.
It's very subtle. Say that again, David?
Yeah. I was just saying, like, right there, you could hear the difference the most between,
yeah,
like,
there's some notes
like
you can hear
more
it.
powerful low frequency.
Mm-hmm.
And then the kind of boxier regular.
Yep. So what I'm going to do, and just for time's sake, just so we're not doing this forever, I'm going to do a couple things real quick. So I am actually going to roll off some highs, and the only reason I'm going to do that is just because there's just a lot of cymbal bleed. Just to cut down on some cymbal bleed and some vocals a little bit. And there's a good bit of snare bleed in there. So what I'm going to do is seeing how there's a couple peaks right up here. It's really nice in the dynamic EQ. Whenever Nathan sings, you can see a good bit of peaks up here. This is where the vocal range presides. So I'm going to do some sweeping again.
And you can do this boost and sweep whether you have the waveform going up and down, like visually, or with an EQ that doesn't show you that.
Yep.
That's why it's so useful, because you can use it on.
I do also recommend, if you're looking for specific stuff, use a graphic, but if you're just EQing, after a little while, start to use more of a, just a regular EQ, like just a regular knob where you can't actually see it, because that way you're listening for stuff rather than thinking, oh, this should be here. So let me boost it here or cut it here.
A good way to limit yourself is use something like this, where you just see the volume levels and you just see what you're picking, but you don't see how it's changing. This is kind of forcing yourself. If you find trouble where you're doing stuff based on sight instead of sound, then I would say try looking at an EQ that doesn't show anything and force yourself to actually like listen to the changes. It's just little things to like limit your workflows and like challenge yourself. I find it's really interesting.
That's when you get a little bit more like intermediate advanced level, though. It is definitely way easier to learn how to do it when you can see what you're doing.
Oh yeah, I agree. So anyway, I'm gonna go back sweeping again. So there is some vocals here, but the kick is mainly overpowering this region. Like in terms of volume staging, you can really just hear the kick is overpowering whatever's there in that region. So I'm not going to cut anything because I feel like that would do more harm than good. I'm going to leave that alone. One thing I will do, I'm not going to boost any highs just because there isn't much up there. And again, the same thing, it's just going to do more harm than good. However, I am going to roll off low end on the fabled kick. Only up to like 20 hertz. But
Grant, why? Isn't the kick producing the lowest frequencies?
I know, right? So, if we're being totally honest, anything below 20 hertz is just rumble. Like, no matter how much you want it to be a note, it's just rumble. You're not going to get anything clear out of it. All you're going to get is you're going to get something called frequency buildup, which is when frequencies that are, like, not even boosted, but when there's similar frequencies. So, like, for example, say bass resides a lot at 50 hertz, and the kick, for example, stays a lot at 50 hertz. What happens is, since there's a lot of instruments in that same frequency zone, they all compile together and artificially make that frequency louder. So like when you go to the whole mix and you're like, oh, 50 hertz is really loud across everything, I need to pull it out. sometimes you could just roll off some extra low end and focus it a little bit more, and that'll solve your problem. The other reason, there's another big reason too, and it's you see it more with vocals and other instruments that aren't as low based, and we'll touch on that next time, but you're also focusing those higher frequencies a little bit more. So like if something's not cutting, doing something as simple as cutting off some higher frequencies will make it a little bit clearer. But then on the kick and bass, the only reason I would ever do that is just to get rid of some rumble and just make it a little bit punchier, a little bit cleaner. Even on the bass, I'll still roll it off at like 20 dB or 20 hertz.
Yeah, and doing that is what's known as a high pass filter. So it's a little bit confusing because the high pass filter affects the low frequencies, but basically it's letting the high frequencies pass through, hence the name.
Yeah.
And if there were one EQ move that I would say is universal, it's that. I would say 99% of the tracks you record, whether it's vocals or kick drum or any other drum or bass, doesn't matter, you're almost always going to put a high pass filter on it. And even if you weren't to make any of the other EQ changes, even just doing that will clean up your mix massively. So that's really important. If you take one thing away from this, it's use a high pass filter always.
Yeah. Honestly, high pass everything is a good method. And then just do it to the point where like stuff just sounds good. Again, use your ear. Like don't use what you see, use what you hear, because that's ultimately the goal. They're not going to see people when they buy music are not going to see all of your compression and EQ changes. They're going to hear what you did. So it doesn't matter what you see. So anyway, moving on. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to give it a little bit of thump. Again, I'm kind of a little stuck. I can't save the high end, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to boost some of the low end, which in doing this, I might lose some of the high end clarity I do already have. So I'm going to try it and see what happens. Doing it before and after again. So I'm going to find the dominant frequency of the kick, which looks to be about 50-ish hertz. Right there at about 51 hertz, that's the dominant frequency. And what I mean by dominant frequency is the dominant or fundamental, whatever frequency, and it's especially with drums, they tend to pick like one bass frequency, and then everything above that are the harmonics and so on and so forth, referencing some solfege and other stuff. So I'm gonna do before and after this one, see if it actually makes a difference or if I'm just losing too much high end.
If you're not listening on headphones or monitors, I doubt you can hear the difference, because I can barely hear it.
These are all really subtle. Like I can only hear this in the really low end of my headphones. But anyway, I think this is, to my ears, this sounds like a good move. It's not taking away too much high end. I might, however, roll off a little bit more high end.
Right, and that's just about it at this point.
That's pretty much all you can do with the kick at this point.
Yeah. You don't have to EQ
the
one.
only way you could really save this. Yeah. There's no point, like, for example, like, there's no point me going in here, pasting a second version of this EQ just to like double what I'm doing. At that point, it just gets, again, it just gets a little tedious and a little ridiculous, and you end up doing more harm than good. Because now it just sounds like, now that I have two of them doing the exact same thing, so now I'm doing double the cuts and double the boosts. Now it just sounds like, I don't know, actually, I don't know what that sounds like. It does sound thicker, but it doesn't sound like a kick anymore. It just sounds like a low sine wave, or like a low sine pump, which is not what we want. We want it to sound like a kick. I'm gonna take that second one off. And there are some tricks, because I'm not quite getting enough sub out of this, which I might try something, but I'll come back to it. So I think that's pretty much all I'm gonna do with the kick right now. There's not much else to do. If we were getting into more intermediate and advanced techniques, we could try something called sample layering, where you make a copy of the instrument with MIDI and then use samples to overlay it and add more. So like say you're missing high end, you add a sample with high end. But for something like this, it's a little, you don't need to be as polished with something like this. So on that note, let's jump to the snare. So I'm going to do the same thing.
You say that between all the drum drums, like toms, cymbals, snare, kick. Would you say kick and snare is probably the two that really, really have to sound good for the whole kit to sound good?
Are you asking, would I say that?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Like if your kicks sounds poopy, it doesn't have any punch, and it just sounds like a flapping cardboard box, like people will pick up on that. It's like kind of what I forget who mentioned it, but like you have to know your crowd. Like if something, people don't really pick up on things that are too scrutinizing, like, oh, I did this cool little 2 dB cut of just 4K, like I wonder if they'll notice that. Like no, nobody's gonna notice that. But these little sneaky things, like if your kick just sounds bad, like for example, like if it just sounds bad, flappy, there's nothing good about it, people will point that out. Like something that obvious is not going to go unnoticed. So it's like you have to judge here and there based on what you're doing. So anyway, I'm going to jump to the snare next. And I use, for most of my drums, just to sum up, with the overheads being an exclusion, I pretty much do the exact same thing in terms of plugins, unless I really need to like get in there. I'll usually just do some compression and EQ, and that's pretty much it for most of the drums. You don't really need too much else. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the kick. I'm going to bring it down to where I catch some of those louder hits. But you can hear the drummers also doing some ghost notes. So it's really quiet, guys. So that's also why I'm a little bit more encouraged to bring up this snare drum, because I want to bring up the clarity of those ghost notes. There it is. A little couple ones in there. Turn on my ratio. Usually with drums, I like to stay anywhere from 3:1 to 5 or 6:1, depending on the genre. With this genre, we can be a little bit more laid back and go to like somewhere between 3 and 4:1. They're not hitting as hard. The volume differences aren't that crazy. We don't need to cut down as much. And I'm going to do a hotter attack because snare and kick transients are probably the two quickest instrument transients. And what I mean by transient is the instrument or the sound wave's attack. So like how quickly you hear it. I'm going to cut down on that. I'm going to turn off the auto release. I'm not a big fan of this auto release on this plugin, but again, preference. So I'm going to catch the ring of the snare, which is really subtle to hear on this snare. Brung, brung. Just pretty short on this one, but the reason I'm catching the ring is because I want that to be brought up too. So now I'm going to do before and after. I'm going to bring in my makeup to make that volume change the same. And how the ghost notes are more audible now. They actually know they're there and they're not kind of stuck in the background anymore. Like if I turn this back off, the ghost notes kind of disappear for a second.
That is a huge difference. That's crazy.
It's huge. These small little things can make huge differences, and it's crazy. So I'm gonna open up.
Yeah, compression is definitely worth checking out on your own time and really getting your head around, because it's important.
I'm gonna throw in another stock one. This is some of the Reaper stock stuff. And you can get actually the Reaper stock stuff. I would leave a link if I could. I would have to leave it after. But I just put it in the chat what it's called. It's called Repack or Reapack, however you want to, I don't know how that's pronounced. But they give you this. They give you a bunch of different things. They give you all this, they're called JS plugins. If I look up JS. So like all of this is just in a free open source pack on the internet. Which open source plugins are great. Like they don't look the greatest all the time. Like if I go, there's stock EQ that comes with the program. Oh, wrong one. Like this is their stock plugin, their stock EQ. It's not the prettiest looking thing in the world, but it works. And like that's all you need. Their compressor, actually I'm gonna pull up their compressor real quick. Like this isn't the prettiest compressor in the world, but it looks fine, or it works fine. That's all you need it to do. But they all accomplish the same things. Like they do, different plugins will color things differently, but that's not what's important. I'm going to hop back to this guy. So I'm going to start, and again, just for time reasons, I'm going to kind of just talk through what I'm doing, and if anybody has questions, please stop me. So what I'm going to start out with, usually I like to start with a high pass, just to like clean up the signal. So I'm going to bring it up top. I'm going to overdo it where it sounds nasty. I'm going to slowly bring it back down until snare starts to sound like it's normal again.
I love that tactic. I think that's so smart.
It's so nice. It's like right about here. If I turn that off. Here are the kicks kind of in the track. Then I'll turn that high pass filter on. And it kind of disappears. It's still kind of there because you can hear the snare wires rattling, but the main thump of it is gone. So now the next thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to listen to it after that cut, because when you cut frequencies, you're essentially making everything above that cut louder, because now these frequencies down here are no longer taking up the sound file space or the audio space of that sound file. So everything else I think it's with the Fletcher-Munson curve. I don't know if it's specifically with that one or if there's a different theory for that. But pretty much that theory states that you hear higher frequencies louder or better than you would at lower frequencies. Like lower frequencies need more power to be heard at the same volume as higher frequencies. So when you cut all those those low frequencies out, the higher frequencies sound way louder. Well, not way louder, but a decent bit louder. So sometimes if you're missing like high end, something as simple as doing a high pass filter can add that high end, and that's all you need to do.
Yeah, that's called the Fletcher-Munson curve. It's a curve that depicts the frequency response of the human ear. So just like Grant said, lower frequencies sound quieter even if they're at the same level as higher frequencies.
So what I'm going to do next, so I'm going to listen to it. And to me, it sounds pretty fine. The only thing I might try is I want it to be a little bit thicker. It's a little slappy without some of the thickness and like the thump, the low end. But to do that, I'm going to take out some of the papery, like boxy mids. I'm going to pull some mids out and see what that does. So I'm going to sweep. So I also found the ring of the drum. Then I'm going to do before and after, make sure I did my change right. It's very, very subtle. This one is really subtle, but like snare just gets a little bit thicker. It's all these little slight things make huge differences. And the only other thing I might find is I'm going to see if I can find some stick attack up here. So I'm going to go stick attack for snares usually sits up right above your presence range. So right at the start of like 4K, 5K is usually where your snare attack sits. So we're starting to get it. A little too high. So right about there, around 5K-ish. And pull it fully out. Probably just a little bit. I'm gonna do before and after. That one's even more subtle. One thing I might try, I'm not hearing that one doing as much of a difference. I can hear the frequency being boosted, which I don't think a lot of you are going to be able to hear that because that's, again, really subtle. But I'm going to try, instead of doing that was called a band pass, these guys, where they're just taking out a specific section, I'm going to try what's called a shelf. So what this does is it's boosting frequencies from a certain point and up to infinity. So I'm going to try that instead. I'm going to make it a little bit more steep. I'm going to do before and after. So this one's much more obvious. But the one thing I will point out, the one problem of doing this shelf, especially on recording like this, hear how there's a lot more hi-hat now? Like now half of the sound is just half hi-hat. Whereas before, the snare was the dominant instrument and it wasn't competing as much. Where now the hi-hat's taking up almost the same volume displacement as the snare is. So instead of doing that, I'm going to try something else. I'm going to try what's called gating, which is pretty much cutting any audio from a certain point down. So like, for example, this number down here is the threshold, which is it's kind of like how a compressor works when it tells the gate where to kick in pretty much. So right now I'm going to follow this audio and find where the loudest snare hits are. And already, even like halfway up, it's already starting to disappear. That's also because the hold is at 0 milliseconds. So hear how extreme that is, and it's pretty much just the snare. Now we do lose a little bit of the ghost notes, but hopefully some of those come through with the overheads. So I'm going to drop the attack to 1 millisecond, again with that transient that I was talking about earlier. Snare attacks and kick attacks are some of the fastest instruments. I'm going to increase the hold to where I hear the ring of the snare.
Yeah, gates are definitely good to use with instruments that have a lot of like sharp attack to them, like drums.
Yeah, like I would never use a gate with a bass just because the audio is so much more consistent. It wouldn't make sense.
And that's also another more intermediate advanced thing that we might not get super into, but if you're at that level, definitely check out gating and learn what it is and how to use it, because it's super useful, as you can see.
Yep. So at this time, again, just for time reasons, since we're almost at the end of our meeting, I'm just going to go through, now that we talked about this with two instruments, I'm going to turn the gate off for this one. I'm going to leave most of my changes just to EQ and compression. So I'm going to take the gate off, and I'm just going to do it really quick just to these other drums, just so we can get an idea for how that works. So I'm going to select, ooh, that rack tom. That is a spicy rack tom. So I'm just going to do a copy paste real quick, just so I can get the effects over there without having to search for them. Ooh, this is kind of the thing where the recording really matters. So I'm going to bring this down just a little bit. And if I extend this loop a little bit, you'll actually hear the snare is triggering the ring of the tom a little bit. Hear how that tom's ringing when the snare hits? So I'm going to let that keep going because I want to do something with that. Ooh, this is a good example. I'm actually overdoing it on the compressor. The turning on the compressor is actually louder than the original volume. Here, everything gets louder, so I got to pull the makeup down a little bit. Okay, that's better. Yes, sometimes you can overdo it because you don't want to add volume with the compressor. Like if your stuff's just quiet, get a gain plugin, which let me pull one up real quick. This is the Blue Cat stuff. Blue Cat stuff is all free plugins. Check that in the chat. They have a really nice frequency analyzer and other stuff. I would highly recommend getting their pack of plugins. But anyway, jumping back to this. If your track's too quiet, bring it up with the gain knob, then compress it. Don't bring up the makeup gain because you're changing the dynamic balance of the track, and that's not what you want to do. Let me go back to this again. So that's pretty much where I want it. I don't have a problem with that. It's just catching the tom hits. It's not catching any of the snare, any other bleed. I'm going to go to an EQ now. I'm going to reset this, quote unquote. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to high pass, go way past where I think I should. All the low end's gone. Come back. We can see that the dominant frequency of this tom is around like 100 hertz-ish. pull back just a little bit more, just in case. About 80 hertz-ish. Which, honestly, is a little bit low for rack tom. I think it could have just been tuned up a little bit higher. But, again, we're not at that point. So we don't have any say in this. So I'm going to find that nasty-sounding frequency. Little bong. There she is. So I'm going to try a thinner Q, which is just saying how thin or thick this band is, or how many frequencies I'm going to pull out. So I'm going to try a little bit because it's very specific. I'm going to try spreading it out. Yeah, and that one, again, we're probably not going to be able to do too much about that. That's just kind of in the track, and that's something we might just have to deal with. And I'm just going to double check and make sure there's not... One thing I'm looking for with this is I'm looking for upper octaves or harmonies. So that pitch, that little overtone of the drum will probably have a harmony that's up. I forget what the specific number is, but it'll probably have a harmony above it. And I can probably pull it out by doing that as well. There's one there. So pull a little bit of that out. So yeah, already it sounds a little bit cleaner, but again, we're probably still not going to be able to get rid of that. We're probably not going to be able to change the way it sounds without doing something crazy. And then the last thing I'm going to do, get this out of the way. I'm just going to drag a low pass just to get rid of... There's a lot of hi-hat bleed on this track because it's right next to the hi-hat. That's probably about as far as I could go before affecting the tom sound. Like here, the tom pretty much sounds the same, but the hi-hat's a little bit gone. Okay, so I'm gonna do the same thing with the floor tom, and I really liked how the floor tom sounded. Nice and thick, it's a little punchy. So I'm gonna bring it in just a little bit tighter. The only thing I notice about this is that there's a lot of kick bleed in this thing. Like the kick is pretty much in this track too. So I'm gonna double check my compressor first. Yeah, pretty much is the same. If I would have copied it from the snare, I definitely would have had that same volume issue because I'm not cutting as much. And usually with toms, I try to aim for like 5 dB reduction, which is saying when the compressor turns on, it's reducing that track's volume by 5 dB for that split second. So I'm going to jump to EQ. And to preserve the low end of that tom, that's probably about as far as I'm going to go, which is a little bit harder because this is also where the kick sits. The tom is rounding out at about 60-ish hertz. And the kick is sitting at about 50, so already I can tell they're going to be in some conflict with each other. And the other thing I'm going to do, get all that boxiness out of there. Then do before and after. Just a little bit thicker. Oh, not that. And then do the same thing with the rack, try and get some cymbal bleed out of there. There we go. And again, that's pretty much all I can do to it without doing anything crazy. One thing I usually like to do with tom tracks is I just do tom editing, which is where, for example, so I'll go like right up, I'll do tab to transient, where if you hit tab, it'll take you to the next available transient. So you can go through and just hit all the transients of your tom attacks. What I like to do, and what a lot of people like to do, is they'll tab. So they'll find your transient, cut the track, find out where it ends, and then what you'll do is, what you're essentially doing is you're isolating those hits. So instead of having bleed like this kick bleed the entire time, I'm just gonna separate a section just for a little bit. So it's dead silent. And then the tom comes in for when it needs to. You're pretty much doing, with all this editing, it's pretty much manual gating is what you're doing. You're pretty much creating a gate by literally just getting rid of the audio altogether. It gives you a little bit more control than a gate does. Like sometimes a gate, like I was saying with the snare and ghost notes, like the gate on the snare that I had was getting the louder hits of the snare, but it was missing the ghost notes. So that's some things that editing can be nice for. I don't do it on a snare too much because usually you're hitting the snare a lot. So you don't really need to do it. I only do it for toms because they only hit, like, as you can see, the floor tom only hits like maybe 15 times or something like that. That's easier to edit than, say, like a snare that hits, you know, hundreds of times during a song. But that's another technique you can try. And then last thing for drums, again, I'm zooming through this so I can get to bass so I don't go too long. If anybody has any questions, speak now or forever hold your peace. Cool. All right, I'm gonna keep going. So with overheads, I personally, and maybe this is just me doing a lot of metal, but I personally like to overcompress my overheads. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull down the threshold until I'm pretty much catching everything. And then I like to do, personally, I like to do really extreme ratios of like 8-to-1, 10-to-1. Like really get, like, hear how you get those really snappy transients? All the drums are really snappy. So I'm gonna pull down the attack a little bit to get some of that. I don't want to get too snappy. If I get too tight, then it just sounds clicky. And then I'm going to increase the release until I catch those cymbal crashes. And the one thing I do notice is I am hitting -20 reduction, so I think I am just reducing a little bit too much. And for this genre, I can be a little bit more gentle. I don't need to fully overdo it. Like, you're not in a full, like, rock or metal mix where you need to, like, make room for everything. Cut down the big drum hits and do a good bit on the snare reduction. I'm gonna bring up my volume. If you listen close enough, you can actually hear the compressor turning off. Listen for those straight snare hits. It's really subtle, but listen for those snare hits. You can actually hear the compressor turn off and the rest of the volume come back up. If you listen to, I can hear it especially, if you listen to the violin and guitar, you can hear their volumes come up shortly after the snare hits.
Yeah, it's kind of pumping.
Yeah, you can hear it pump a little bit. I like to do that with my overheads because that gives the, like, whole drum image a little bit more direction, if that makes sense, like musical direction, because now you're essentially inputting energy into the performance. So now literally you're making the track move a little bit more. And I might back off a little bit more because I am being a little bit aggressive on this, but I'll see how it sounds in context after I do some EQ. So I'm going to do that real quick. I'm going to add some EQ. And with the overheads, I like to cut off with the high-pass filter. I like to keep going until the kick fully disappears. Because you have a kick track, you don't need the kick to be in your overheads. You really just need it for your cymbals. And some drum ambience, but mostly for cymbals. So the kick is pretty much gone. You can still hear it, but it's pretty much gone. But the cymbals don't sound changed in any way. Like, the cymbals still sound the same for the most part. If I turn that off. You can actually hear some bass in there too. Just something as simple as that just isolates it. So the other thing I'm going to do with this is, again, kind of the same with the other tracks. I'm going to pull some boxiness out. Just makes cymbals sound weird and washy. There we go. Then I'm gonna add just a little bit of a shelf because I do want my cymbals to be a little bit brighter. But I might consider, instead of doing it here on this track, I might do it on the whole drum bus because I kind of also want the whole image of the drums to be brighter, not just the overheads. So I might mess around with that a little bit later, but I won't get too deep into it. And then last thing I'm gonna do is there's something a little nasty. There's a nasty frequency from the hi-hat I can hear. There it is. 2.9K. Again, really subtle things, but once you start, you hear these things a lot more once you start doing some more like full mix bus mixing and mastering, like more complicated techniques, because these little cuts and things, if you don't do them, really show up when you start using limiters, which is essentially bringing up the entire volume of a track. But when you apply it to the whole bus, these problems become more and more obvious. So you start to notice it a little bit more once you do that. But at this stage, it's a little hard to hear some of these things. So now, I forgot to mention one last thing. So this is a concept I like to use. So the nice thing about this EQ I mentioned is it also uses different audio modes, I guess is what I will call it. So audio comes in a couple different ways. It comes in mono or stereo is probably the two that you guys are used to. But a couple different ones, there's just a couple different techniques for making that audio become one, for example. So like stereo is just when you hear something that's stereo, you're hearing something out of the left and right speaker or left and right headphone. But when you hear mono, you're hearing the same amount of something out of both speakers or headphones. That's what makes it seem like it's in the center, because it's the same amount coming out of each speaker. But then you also have different modes, like difference. You have left and right. You can do something called dual mono, which personally for things like stereo buses like this, I like to use dual mono because I think, at least for my ears, it sounds slightly wider than stereo, because what it's doing is it's essentially processing it instead of as a left-right stereo, like as one thing, it's now processing it as a left channel and a right channel. So if I switch back, this one's really subtle. Again, really, this one's probably the most subtle thing I will show, but I think like dual mono stuff really just helps make stuff just slightly a little bit wider. Now that I think about it, I'm actually going to go make all of these mono. Because sometimes if you put a mono track, at least in my experience of using this plugin, if you put a mono track and use stereo mode, sometimes it screws with the picture. Like it'll make a mono track slightly wider than it should be. But I don't know, that's just in my experience. Do this last one, then we can listen to the drum mix as a whole. That doesn't sound bad. I like that. Even the kick's fine. I could still use some more high end, but like the punch is there and you know it's there.
Definitely not a weak kick.
Yeah, it's not bad. There are a couple more things I could do. The one thing that is peeving me a little bit is that tom bleed on the rack tom. Especially whenever the snare hits, that's all I hear. I'm gonna see if I can't cut it a little bit more. This is actually one instance where I will use another EQ. I'm just gonna take these guys off. And the only reason I'm using another EQ is just because I really want to ham in on one frequency and I've already used up my other knobs. Or like my other knobs are in that frequency. Let's do high. Actually, yeah, you can kind of see it. See how the tom, whenever it's hit, is presiding down here, but the bleed, whenever the snare hits, is hitting right here? There it is. So it's still there, but it's so much less obvious. Cool. Yeah, and again, it still sounds kind of poopy, but again, there's nothing we can do about that. We're just kind of stuck with that. All right, so again, we are already a little bit over time, but if you guys are chill for a couple more minutes, we can talk about some bass real quick. That shouldn't take as long as the drums.
Nah, bass is easy.
Yeah, bass is straightforward. So, again, just for time's sake, I'm gonna just let this play and do a couple things. So, just listening off the bat, like, this sounds like a good DI. Like, there's nothing wrong, really. The only thing I hear is there is a little bit of noise. Hear how, like, way up top there's like the staticky noise going on? That's the only negative thing I would say, though. So what I like to do, so what I'm gonna start with is I'm actually gonna duplicate this track. So now we have 2 of the same track. But what I'm gonna do, let me get that compressor again. I'm gonna mute one of these, I don't need to hear it right now. So first I'm gonna compress it. Oh, do I have something else soloed? Michael, are you sure this is a DI and not a mic?
Yeah, that was DI.
I must be going crazy. Can you guys hear the band in the background?
Not at all.
I can hear it.
It's really subtle. Hold on.
Yeah, it's
I'm gonna
super subtle.
This might be a little loud. They're just slightly back. What the heck? Okay, now I'm just confused.
Probably my pickups on my bass picking it up. I was in front of a monitor.
Oh, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, the only reason I'm for everybody else, the only reason I'm confused why I'm hearing that at all is because bass pickups shouldn't pick that up at all. Like, that's not what they're meant to do. Bass pickups work with magnets, and they pick up literally the strings vibrations. But with Michael's comment on the monitor, what's happening is the monitor vibrations are so much louder that it's actually forcing the pickups to pick that up as movement on the strings. Oh, it's crazy. That's actually kind of cool. I like that.
So normally that isn't going to happen.
Yes.
Usually you won't hear anything else.
This is like 1 in a million. I'm going to do some like 4 or 5 to 1. I don't have to be too fast with the attack because he's not slapping. He's just playing with his fingers. So I can be a little bit more gentle in the attack. I'm going to leave the release a good bit longer so I catch those longer notes. See how the sustain drips well below the threshold? Which I might drop it just a little bit more. Then I'm just going to check my before and after. Made it just a little bit louder. All right. And then what I like to do, I'm going to grab this stock EQ. So I'm going to rename these guys. What I like to do personally is I like to separate the bass into 2 different elements. So like I like to make a bass low track and a bass high track. So what I mean by that is I'm going to put a low pass. This is the low track. Put a high pass. Bring it down. Keep going until I lose all that mid definition. Till I just get the low end rumble. Just get that low end rumble. Because what I'm doing is I look at a bass as 2 different parts. I look at it as with a bass, you want a nice, clean, flat low end response. And then with the high end, you want some distortion, maybe some fuzz, maybe like, I don't know, something to color it and give it a little bit more attack. With the low end, you don't want to do that because if you throw a distortion or a fuzz on low end, it just gets all wobbly. It's not as clean and consistent anymore. So to be the bridge of both worlds, I like to separate them into 2 different elements. So I'm essentially going to copy and paste these 2 things. But what I'm going to do on the high track is I'm going to do the opposite. So I brought the low pass down to 280 hertz. So I'm going to disable that. But I'm going to bring let me turn this track on. So I'm going to put on a high pass instead. I'm going to bring that up to 280 hertz where the low pass is. So now there's no low end definition. It's just all high end. You can hear what the notes are, but you don't feel the notes. So now that we have them as two separate elements, it's going to sound the same as if I didn't do anything. But what I will do, what I like to do the high track, is I like to do, there's this plugin. It's pretty much a stance amp pedal, if anybody knows what those are. It's a little bit of some drive, a little bit of some distortion. So I'm gonna actually, since there's a good bit of fuzz, or not fuzz, since there's a good bit of noise going on, I'm actually gonna cut that real quick. So it doesn't go into the pedal, because if I have noise going into a pedal, it's just gonna add some coloration that I don't want. So right there, all the noise is gone. It's probably like 10K and up, there's some noise. I'm gonna turn that back on. You can even hear the noise trying to come back. So if I turn this off, hear how there's a little bit more attack on that? I'm actually gonna bring up the highs a little bit. I'll drop this one down in the comments. This is called the TSE Audio BOD. TSA makes a bunch of interesting stuff. They have an 808, like a guitar overdrive pedal clone. That's kind of interesting too. They have a couple different things that are all free that are really nice to use. I highly recommend, like, even just messing around with them. Like, there's a couple nice records that I have, or that I've, like, songs that I've done where I'll use, like, this just to get, like, that string dangle or whatever. And, like, free plugins, but, like, great sounds. And then they also have a blend knob, but since I have a track where I have all the clean low end, I don't need to use the blend. I can just pretty much have this full pedal. So the only other thing I'm going to do is I might just turn up the drive just a little bit. But I don't want to do too much because I'm adding some noise back. And that's pretty much it. Let's see, let's do some in context.
You know that I even care. Who cares that it's 74? What's up?
We do just bass and drums. So now that I've rolled off some different things, high end and low end, I'm gonna have to bring up the volumes because now the tracks are quieter. There we go. And then with the low end, there's one more thing I'm gonna do. Turn the drums off. To get the low end even more consistent, I usually like to use what's called a multi-band compressor, which is kind of like what that dynamic EQ was that I showed you, which is where it'll compress the track, but it'll only compress like a certain frequency range. And I like to do that for my low end just to get the low end really consistent. But again, that's really a intermediate to advanced. That's really an advanced technique. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to use a limiter, which what a limiter is, it's pretty much a compressor, but it's everything turned up to like 100. So what this is, like what I was talking about earlier with the ratio, how this goes up to like infinity to 1, that's pretty much what a limiter is. The ratio is set at infinity to 1. Whenever something goes over the threshold, it is immediately just cut down. So I'm going to do this on the low end because I'm trying to make it more consistent. I'm going to bring down the ceiling, which is telling the audio track I don't want to be any louder than 2.5 dB or something like that, and then it will not go over that amount. I'm gonna keep pulling it down a little bit just till it gets even. What I'm listening for is on the releases, because usually on the releases of some notes is where you'll lose the most volume. That sounds fine to me. And then in context with the drums. And now that I limited the low end and brought it up, I'm gonna bring the track down a little bit. You don't lose the bass anywhere, even on that long sustain. You hear the low end the whole time, it doesn't dip. which is essentially the goal. But and personally, I would think about adding a little bit more fuzz to this, but I think for this genre, this pedal addition is fine. If it was me, I would use some of my hardware stuff, like add a bass or guitar pedal that I have sitting down behind me. But again, for something like this, we're not going to get too crazy. But yeah, I think that's mostly drums and bass. I wouldn't do any
drums and bass. Let's go.
Yeah, anything else? Honestly, anything else that I would do is pretty much. I guess I'll touch on this real quick. The only thing I like to do is just like bus effects. It's like on the whole image by itself. It's like this is the whole drum bus. I'll do another cut. This stuff is very just straightforward, like just a quick high pass and low pass. And this is what I was talking about earlier. If I want the whole drum image to be brighter, I'll bring it up on the bus versus the track itself because you don't create frequency buildups as much. But for this one, I'll probably just do a high pass and a low pass just to make it simple. But yeah, that's pretty much drums and bass.
Sweet. Do we have any questions from the audience? We really appreciate you sticking it out with us. This was a long meeting.
Yeah, I know it was a lot, but we really wanted to try and take it step by step, pretty much.
But yeah, I think if we don't have any questions, then we're probably good to hit stop record and wrap it up.